This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning everyone. Shalom Aleichem. We're beginning a topic which is an unprecedented subject. You know, when we speak about certain contemporary issues, so for example, if you want to speak about organ donation and you want to know, is it permitted, is it required, is it allowed, is it obligatory, is it permissible to donate an organ, we have precedent for that. We have a Yerushalmi that seems to indicate that perhaps a person is allowed to put their life in risk to save somebody else. The Bavli holds you're not allowed to put your life in risk to save someone else. And that's why back in the day most poskim held you were not allowed to donate an organ, because technically you're not allowed to put your life in jeopardy to save somebody else. Nowadays the procedure is more streamlined. It's not such a sakana. Then it is permitted, maybe it's obligated. There's almost no question in halacha that we don't have precedent. I'll give you an example. More recently we spoke about artificial intelligence. Are you allowed to use it on Shabbos? So you say, well, you know, what possible precedent could there be for artificial intelligence? But there's a Tosfos that talks about if your maiso or your dibur causes an immediate result, is that considered your act? Is it not? In other words, there's almost no contemporary issue that you can't find precedent in Shas and Poskim. But when it comes to the ethics of warfare, this in a way is the most unprecedented halachic subject ever to face Kallah Yisrael. And the reason why it's unprecedented is because from the day that Nebuchadnezzar came and he destroyed the first Beis HaMikdash and he hurled Kallah Yisrael into Galus, we've been persecuted. We've been a nation on the run. We have not been in our own land. We've been in Babylon, in Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Morocco, Egypt, America, France, Germany, and basically we had not been in a settled way in Eretz Yisrael for 2,000 years. And now all of a sudden, for the first time in 2,000 years, Kallah Yisrael returned to Eretz Yisrael in an unprecedented way. And I'm not here to speak about the halachic nature of the state of Israel. That's beyond the scope of the next 2 days. I'm not here to discuss what state and what status in halacha the modern state of Israel has. But nevertheless, the reality is that the country of Israel has a war, has an army. And it's faced with shilas and halacha that has never been faced with in our entire history. And while every other subject in halacha we have precedent, we have tshuvos. Anybody know what is the largest corpus of material of Torah Sheba'al Peh that we have? Is it Gemara? Is it the Rambam? Is it, you know, the biggest corpus of material is Shilas Uchuvas Shailom Eshev. The Chuvas of Rav Yosef Shal Halevi Natanzan is the single biggest corpus of material of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. And it's interesting because in the Shailom Eshev he writes that every single year he made a siyum on Tanakh. So interesting. His custom was to be Messiahim, Torah Nevi'im, Ksuvim. You know, Reb Chaim Kanievsky was Messiahim Shas every year. He was Messiahim, Torah Nevi'im, and Ksuvim every year. And question is, we have no tshuvas in the Noda B'Yehuda of how a Jewish army is supposed to conduct warfare. Do we have any limitations? Do we have to knock on doors and say, Rabbi Sai, we're coming, all innocent civilians live now? Do we have to do that? Are we obligated to do that? Do we have to send out leaflets? We have no tshuvas in the Chassam Sofer, not in the Noda B'Yehuda, not in Rabbi Kiva Eger, not in the Shlomo Kluger. We have no precedent of how to engage in a halachic war. So you'll ask, what's the nafkamina? Are they asking us how to engage in war? That's not relevant. We're not dealing with practically are they asking us. We want to know halachically, what is the responsibility when you're conducting warfare and you have to protect the Jewish people, let's say from either terrorists. Is there a concept of reprisal in Jewish halacha? In other words, let's say they attack us. And now it's not a matter of saving lives, because our borders are secured. Are you allowed to take revenge? Is there a concept of revenge in halacha? We have nothing about this. We have no tshuvas about this. The Gemara doesn't discuss this. Even in the times of the Gemara, we were in Galus, we were living in Bavel. There's no army. There's no Babylonian army. So we have nothing in Torah Shabbat Peh. And really, the only precedent we have are the wars that were waged by David and Shlomo. But David HaMelech did not write Shalos Tshuvas She'elas David. We don't have Tshuvas of David. We just know what he did. So the question is, can we use stories in Chumash and Nevi'im and Ksuvim as a precedent for halacha? Are you allowed to learn halacha from Sukkim? If you saw on the sheet, Rav Asher Weiss was asked by a judge in Israel about a husband who killed the wife and then wanted to yarshin her. Yeah? So, why not? Okay, he has to deal with the capital punishment, but why would that affect monetary law? So Rav Asher Weiss brings the story in the Nevi'im where Achav killed somebody, and the Navi rebukes Achav for killing Navos HaYisraeli. He says, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta? You killed and now you want to yarshin? Is that a halacha? Maybe it's not a halacha, but it's a compelling logic. It's a compelling logic. So that's the question. Can we study the narratives of the Chumash, the Nevi'im, and the Ksuvim to learn halachas? And the other question is, do we need to do so? So I want to tell you something very interesting. I see we have a very wide gamut of the spectrum of Klal Yisrael in the room, and I know the various opinions regarding the status of some of the individuals we're going to mention. So I ask you to have the open-mindedness enough that if we cite certain people, take what they say for their content without casting judgment on your personal opinion about them as individuals. I'm going to start with an individual who lived from 1909 to 1995. And if you went to maybe, the Haredi yeshivas, you may not even be familiar with him. Rav Shaul Yisraeli. Rav Shaul Yisraeli wrote the single most influential essay on Jewish military ethics. It sent shockwaves through the Jewish world. He wrote, Judaism does not have moral teachings about how to behave during war. There is no required precedent of how a Jewish army needs to conduct themselves. There's no Gemara that says what a soldier can and can't do. There's no Gemara that says a soldier has to aim at a terrorist, and if there's a human shield in front of him, he has to desist. The Gemaras don't say what to do. And therefore, Rabbi Yisraeli paskind, there is no governing halachic direction regarding Jewish warfare. In a certain way, it makes life very easy. So what does govern Jewish warfare? By the way, just to get a little history about Rav Shaul Yisraeli. So he grew up in Belarus. His father was exiled to Siberia for teaching Torah Barabim. And this Rav Shaul Yisraeli continued to teach Torah in the underground. And he tried many, many times to escape from Europe unsuccessfully. Finally, in 1933, he is caught by Polish border guards, and almost certainly this would have meant immediate execution, if not for the interference of Rav Yitzchak HaKohen Cook, who saved the life of Rav Shaul Yisraeli and brought him to British Mandate Palestine. Rav Shaul Yisraeli was a Talmud of Rav Cook, then a Talmud of Rav Cook's son, and then ultimately the Mamala Makoim of that yeshiva. And he paskind, a Jewish army is not subject to any government or dictates based on halachic direction, because there is no halachic direction when it comes to warfare, because we have no precedent whatsoever. There's no Gemaras, and even if they were, all a Jewish army is subject to is international law. The halacha only subjects the Jewish army to international law. He says, what right does any country have to go to war in the first place? But, by the way, nothing I'm saying is on your sheets. What year was this? 1960s, 1970s. He says, what right do countries have to go to war? Well, how could you go to war? How can you just kill people? Because there's an understanding, a universal understanding, that for countries to be able to exist, sometimes eis shalom ve'eis milchama. This is not a permission given by the Torah. This is a universal rishus, a universal treaty of mankind, that sometimes you're allowed to go to war. And whatever the guidelines of war of this universal treaty is, in other words, if international law is you can't kill civilians, then you can't kill civilians. If international law is you could kill civilians when you're going after terrorists, then you could kill civilians. If international law is you're not allowed to kill children when they're human shields, then you're not allowed to kill children. What binds you by this international law? A bris, a universal bris of mankind. That was his opinion. This was an essay that sent shocks through the Jewish world, and there seems to be a very large segment of Israeli society that subscribes to this ideology. This is the ideology of Rav Shaul Yisraeli.
Why did it send shocks?
What?
Why did it send shocks to the Jewish world?
Because, I'll explain to you. Comes another individual to the scene. Well, to me it's very shocking, because we're sort of accustomed to thinking that there is no subject in life in general that we don't have direction from the Torah. I mean, we grow up, if you have to put on your right shoe first, then you put on your left shoe, then you tie your left shoe, but if you're a lefty, you tie your right shoe. I mean, we're not familiar with any single minor practice or minor detail that's not governed by the halacha. And now you're saying that the life and death of a mankind is not, there's no guidelines, there's no direction from the Torah of how to conduct that it's governed by universal treaty. What area in any aspect of life, Choshen Mishpat, Yeridea, Even Oezer, who ever heard of such a concept? We never even heard of this concept in any area of life, let alone such a broad area. Yeah.
Is there an obligation if you're in Hadassah, say like Hamas and Degan was on the city kill?
Yeah.
They killed Jewish people. The other guy, he was identified.
Now I'm just, introducing the subject in general. We'll get into specific questions once the principles are outlined. I'm still introducing the introduction, because every rabbi likes to say a few words before he begins to speak. Okay?
On the bus you get done.
Okay. Yeah. So this was the opinion of Rav Shaul Yisraeli. Comes to the scene an individual also in the Olam HaYeshivas. I don't think the name is generally mentioned, and I don't think his works are generally studied. A very courageous, brave individual, a great scholar. He was born in Poland at the end of World War I. His parents flee hunger and pogroms. He moved to Palestine as a young boy. He fought with Haganah. He fought with the IDF during the War of Independence. And then he served for 20 years as the chief chaplain of the IDF, and then later the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who wrote a major work on the ethics of warfare. It's called Meshiv Milchama, many volumes. And he is the one who invented the concept of halachic ethics of war. And that indeed, the same way every aspect of Torah is governed by Shas and Poskim and the background of Chamisha Chumshei Torah, Nevi'im and Ksuvim, there is a halachic imperative of how to fight war. And this was, so to speak, the invention of Reb Shlomo Goren, who was a controversial figure. Reb Ovadia Yosef fought vehemently his candidacy as chief rabbi, and mostly because of a particular incident about the Langer family, the Langer children, who there was a question about their lineage because the mother had been previously married and then she married somebody else, and now there's a question whether the children were mamzerim or not. And Rabbi Goren said that if we don't find some kind of loophole here to allow the children to remain bekahal, then the Israeli government is going to start governing the marriage process in the state of Israel, and that we can't have because then they're going to allow civil marriages. So to uphold the sanctity of Jewish lineage, l'shem shamayim, he was trying to come up with some kind of loophole, which Rabbi Vadia Yosef said was absolutely wrong, and the Agudas Yisrael said it's not halachically sanctioned. But you should know, just as an aside, that Rabbi Yoshe bar Soloveitchik agreed with him, and so did Rav Henkin. Rav Henkin agreed with him. Yeah. So that's just the background. He was when when the old city was liberated. You have the famous pictures of him blowing the shofar, and he was the one who single-handedly liberated Hebron. So the IDF. He was supposed to be following the IDF into Hebron the day after they liberated the old city, and the IDF was, so to speak, behind him. And he was the first one into the city of Hebron. He removed their flags. He put up the Israeli flag. He liberated the Maras HaMachpelah. And then a few days later, Moshe Dayan said sorry, and he gave back Hebron to the Arabs. So he also believed in remaining, upholding sovereignty of the Har HaBayis, and he went there on many occasions. But I'm just giving you background that the concept, the first one really to bring up that a Jewish army is subject to halachic guidelines and basis from Shas and Poskim was Rabbi Goren. So the question is, okay, what halachic basis is there for warfare? Just if we look at the first sheet of Mar Mekaymos in the Minchas Ashar and Parshas Matos, he brings up the question of whether you could learn halachos straight from Nevi'im and Ksuvim. By the way, there's a general subject. Can you learn halacha from Agadata? Can you learn halacha from Agadata Gemara? So that, on page 28, the Minchas Ashar brings, that's a machlokes achronim, that could you learn halacha from Agadata? The Shvus Yaakov says you could learn halacha from Agadata as long as you don't have any contradiction from Shas. In other words, there's a klal, ein lemeidim min ha'agada. We don't learn from Agadata. So the Shvus Yaakov says, hey, you don't learn from Agadata. That's when you have a Gemara Mefureshes against the Agadata. But if you have a straight up Agadata and it seems to indicate certain practice, you are allowed to learn from it. The Noda B'Yehuda says no, not at all. Noda B'Yehuda says you could have a straight up Agadata Gemara without any stira from Shas and Poskim, and you don't follow it. Agadata Gemara is not compelling evidence to how to conduct yourself in any issue. Which is, it's hard to understand. There's so many different examples of Agadatas that we learn from. There's a famous Gemara in Psachim that the Tzfardeya. I'm bringing up the Tzfardeya because today we might see a few Tzfardeya in the Everglades. According to the Ramban, Tzfardeya are alligators. But the Tzfardeya jumped into the fire, and that's the source for the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. Right? Where the Gemara asks in Psachim, why did Hanani, Mishael, Azariah jump into the fire? They made a Kavachomer from the Tzfardeya. The Tzfardeya, who were commanded they could go into the kneading bowls and they could go into the tables, they went into the fires. So we're Mitzvah and Kiddush Hashem, certainly we should. I mean, you're learning from Tzfardeya, it's an Agadata Gemara. But that is cited as the source for Kiddush Hashem. But the opinion of the Noda B'Yehuda is you cannot learn anything from Divrei Agada. However, stories in Tanakh may be different. Stories in the Chumash, according to the way the Mefarshim explain it, maybe they're not halachic rulings, but certainly they would give us some direction in terms of how we conduct ourselves. So a few examples in Bavli will not look at a story in Chumash and say, oh, they did this and this and this, okay, we paskin this way. But in the Yerushalmi, there are a number of examples where, for example, in Gemara Moed Katan, how do we know Avelos is 7 days? So it says, Vayas la'aviv avel shivas yamim. So Yerushalmi asks, but you can't learn out Koydem Matan Torah. So Gemara brings a different pasuk, that upon the death of Nadav Avihu, uPesach oyamoye teishvu yoimam v'layla shivas yamim. So it seems that the source of Avelos, the Yerushalmi learns from pasuk in Chumash. How can you learn from pasuk in Chumash? That's what they did. They happened to do that. Maybe it's not halachically binding, but you see, there is an idea that if this is the way the religion was practiced in the times of the Chumash, you could learn out from their halacha l'maisa. Or there's an idea of ein ma'arvin simcha b'simcha. Where do we learn that from? Ein ma'arvin simcha b'simcha. We learn out from the Lavan, from your Zayda. Your grandfather Lavan said to Yaakov Avinu, Malei shavu azais. How do you learn out halacha from what Lavan did? But apparently, you could learn out from Matan Torah. So the question is, okay, very good. Let's assume Lamedim midivrei masiyos shebetorah. What wars were conducted in the Torah that we could learn out? In other words, let's say after October 7th. So you have a few thousand terrorists in Gaza. And let's theoretically assume they're also innocent civilians, okay? Just for the sake of theory. Okay, I'll tell you off camera something about that. But let's assume that the civilians are innocent. And they're using civilians as human shields. Are you allowed to kill innocent people in order to take revenge against murderers? In order to kill murderers to prevent them from potentially killing Jews one day? In other words, how careful does one have to be not to kill an innocent civilian? Do we have any precedent in the Torah of how to deal with these so-called innocent civilians? So off the bat, we know that when Yaakov Avinu was facing Esav, if you look on page 4, so it says Yaakov Avinu was very afraid. Vayira Yaakov ma'od vayetzo. Yaakov was afraid, he was distressed. Rashi says, Vayira, he was afraid lest he be killed. Vayetzo lo, he was distressed, im yaharoig hu es acherim, lest he kill others. Now Rashi doesn't say he was afraid he would kill Esav. And I know, right, if you listen to the Shiurim, we know the acherim maybe is a pidrush. But simply, why does Rashi say he was afraid lest he would kill others? Why doesn't Rashi say he was afraid lest he would kill Esav? It seems that he's not afraid lest he'll kill Esav. Esav was coming to kill him. Haba lahargacha, hashkem v'hargai. Esav was a roidev. But maybe Yaakov Avinu was afraid that in the course of killing Esav, maybe he would kill innocent civilians, which, by the way, the Maral says that even though they were also coming to kill Yaakov Avinu, so they weren't really innocent, but the Maral says, but maybe a few of them were just getting caught up in the social pressure, and they really weren't coming to kill, and Yaakov could never really know for sure, so Yaakov was afraid that he might end up killing a quote-unquote innocent civilians, and that distressed him. So can we learn from there that you have to be careful not to kill an innocent civilian? Or do you say, no, just the opposite? Yaakov Avinu went to war, and he was going to do it. Maybe all we should learn from there is, you're allowed to kill innocent civilians, but you shouldn't rejoice about it. You should feel distressed about it. You should feel tsar that you have to take the life of another human being. So it's very hard to learn out, halachically, are you allowed to, are you not allowed to? All we know is one thing, Yaakov Avinu was going to do it. So if anything, this indicates that you could go to war. Did Yaakov Avinu send a letter to Esav and say, Esav, you're coming to kill me, but I'm dropping a leaflet to your 400 guys that if any of them are on the fringe, they should run away now. Yaakov Avinu didn't do that. So where does it come from? Is an army required to drop a leaflet and say, we're going to carpet bomb this area in 24 hours. If you want to save your life, run now. Otherwise, forever hold your peace. So it's very interesting. If you look in Shmuel, again, this is all by way of introduction. If you look in the Navi Shmuel, so Shaul is commanded to wipe out Amalek. So the first thing he does is he has to count his troops. You're not to count Jews, so he he says, everybody give a sheep, and we're going to count the sheep. Take a look on page 5. Vayavoy Shaul ad Yer Amalek. So Shaul comes to Amalek. Vayorev banochal, and he strives in the valley. Vayomer Shaul el Hakeni. Shaul says to the Keni. Who knows? Who's the Keni? Keni is the family of Yisrael. And Shaul says word, listen. L'chu suru redu mitoich Amaleki. Flee, depart from the Amaleki. Meaning, get out of here. Run. We're going to wipe you out. Penoi sifcha imai. We're going to kill you with them. So this is basically the precursor. This is like the precedent that if you're going to fight a war, and there might be innocent civilians there, you drop leaflets and you say, all innocent people, run away. Can you learn from there that you're obligated to do that? Probably not. Look at the pasuk continues. V'ata asisa chesed im kol bnei Yisrael. You, Yisrael's family, we owe you a debt of hakaras hatoiv. You did chesed to us. Ba'aloi sami mitzrayim, when we came out of Egypt. Vayasar keni mitech Amalek. So the Keni fled. So you're going to use this as a precedent that you're required to knock on doors and tell innocents to escape? The pasuk says why Shaul did that. Shaul said, we owe you a debt of gratitude. Yisroi saved our lives. Yisroi housed Moshe Rabbeinu's wife and children. We don't owe a debt of gratitude to the quote-unquote innocent civilians of Gaza. We owe them anything. They did a chesed with us. Many want to use this as a precedent that you're obligated to warn the innocent civilians. Is it a precedent? The Navi says there's a special circumstance in this case. We owed them something. We had gratitude. Their family, their cousins. We owed them something. So again, this is an example of where innocent civilians were warned, but it's very hard to say that this obligates us to follow suit. Okay? That's part 1. And Mayor Glatstein, that's your cue to press the button. Thank you. Okay. Part 2. Let's talk about the Jewish value on human life in general. Because we're talking about innocent civilians. We're all familiar. Anybody who saves one Jewish life, it's like he saved the whole world. What value does the Torah place on human life in general? In other words, is there a value that the same way, we have institution Hatzalah, Ichud Hatzalah, and we put the life of a Jew on the highest pedestal. It's even more important than Shabbos. I remember Rabbi Victor Miller once said, exercise is d'oraisa. I said, really? Exercise d'oraisa? Which pasuk in Chumash is it? He said, it's in this week's parsha. Because in Kisisa it says, we have a drasha, Chalel Shabbos Achas, desecrate one Shabbos, so that you'll be able to keep many, many more Shabbosos. Yeah? So in other words, if somebody's life is on the line, we say we desecrate the Shabbos in order so that this person could keep many Shabbosos in the future. So Miller would say, if you could even desecrate Shabbos to keep more Shabbosos in the future, certainly you need to exercise to be able to keep many Shabbosos in the future. So we know that in Halacha, the life of a Jew is on the highest pedestal. The question is, what about the life of an Akom? What about the life of someone who is not a Ben Yisrael? Do we say Kol HaMakayim Nefesh Achas in general? Imagine somebody's walking down the street and you say, he comes late to the shir. So where were you? He saved the life. Of who? Of an Ovid Kochav Mazalis. Does the halacha put a value on that? The truth is, you could think about it. You could look through Shas. We don't know. We don't know. We're not accustomed to thinking that way. But what's interesting was that when Rav Gorin sort of invented this subject of ethics of war, he began the topic with a very critical analysis of all the Gemaras and Mishnayos in Shas and Yerushalmi and Rambam that quote the statement Kol HaMekayim Nefesh Achas, and some of them it says Mi Yisrael, and other times it doesn't say the word Mi Yisrael. And in some of the most authoritative texts and versions of Shas and the Rambam, it didn't say the word Yisrael, which may have meant that there may have been a value, and there may be opinions, that the same way Jewish life is of the highest value, human life may be of the highest value. And therefore, it has to be taken into consideration that while there might be a need to defend the Jewish people and to protect the Jewish people, but human life is a very big factor, and the Torah places a lot of importance not only on Jewish life, but on human life in general. In fact, if you look in the Sefer Meisha Milchama, we know there's a famous machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai. What's the most important pasuk in the whole Torah? So Rabbi Akiva would say the most important pasuk in the Torah is V'ahavta l'reacha kamaycha. And Ben Azai famously says the most important pasuk in the Torah is Zeh Sefer Toldos Adam. What exactly is the machlokes between V'ahavta l'reacha kamaycha or Zeh Sefer Toldos Adam? It's really this debate. V'ahavta l'reacha kamaycha, we know l'reacha is only reacha b'mitzvahs. V'ahavta l'reacha kamaycha is only to another Jew. There is only a mitzvah in the Torah to love another Jew. Only reacha b'mitzvahs. But zeh sefer toldos Adam is chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. I mean, the Mishnah does say in Pirkei Avos, chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. Chaviv in Yisrael shenikru banim. And therefore the question is, if human life in general is of great value in the eyes of the Torah, Jewish life, but all human life in general, and you have someone who we need to kill, they're a terrorist, maybe they're a roideif, maybe they pose a future danger, and let's say they're being shielded by a quote-unquote, again, theoretical, quote-unquote, innocent civilian. Are you allowed to just indiscriminately kill an innocent civilian? No, not according to the ideal of the Torah. Yeah, but if we don't, then the life of a Jew is at risk. So then certainly, here's the rule in general. Chayecha koidem. The rule is brother rather than other. Your brother is going to come first. So if it means a Jewish life or a life of man in general, no question Jewish life will take precedence. But what if there are 2 innocent civilians? What if there are 10 innocent civilians? What if there are 1,000 innocent civilians? Is there any breaking point where we say, okay, I understand Jewish life is of supreme value, but human life is also valuable. But in general, the rule is going to be brother other than other. In other words, the Torah places value on human life. However, your brother's life will always be more valuable. Could we say, is there a breaking point? Well, wait a second. Moshe shakol keneged shishim riboy. Moshe is the equivalent of 600,000. Yeah, but on the other hand, Moshe shakol keneged shishim riboy, that's in terms of his spiritual value. But if somebody were to say to Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe, kill Yankov Amoretz, or you, Moshe couldn't say, well, I'll take his life because I'm shakol keneged shishim riboy. So this is where the question becomes very sensitive. But again, by way of introduction, this whole subject is based on the predicate that indeed the ethics and the guidelines of warfare will be no different than any other area of halacha. And the same way when it comes to tying shoes, the halacha has something to say about it, and the same way when it comes to every single area of life, the Torah is a Torah's Chaim. It gives us guidelines, and we are not governed by international law how to tie our shoes. In other words, if all countries would get together at the UN and there would be a UN resolution that we should tie the right shoe first, we would still tie the left shoe first. So the same way how we tie our shoes is not governed by international resolution. The predicate of this shiur, of this subject, is there are guidelines of warfare. Can you learn out from Chumash? We're going to have to, because there is no other precedent. There are no Gemaras. They're not going to be Shalos Teshuvos about the subject, because for 2,000 years we had no army, we had no sovereignty. Exactly where we're going to look, can we learn it from Yaakov Avinu? Can we learn it from Shaul HaMelech? So the next part of the shiur, you'll take a look in Hachana, will be the war of Shimon and Levi against the city of Shechem. And Be'ezus Hashem also the war of Moshe Rabbeinu at the end of his life against Midian, which was a very interesting war. Think about it. Why were we attacking Midian? Did they pose a threat to us? They posed no threat to us. We were attacking Midian. Nikoim Nikmas Hashem Me'esam. It was Nakama. Somebody who was on the front lines told me that at this point, maybe it's not a matter of saving Jewish lives. At this point, it's just reprisal. Are you allowed to do that? Maybe you are allowed to do that. Maybe there is a concept of vengeance in halacha. Okay, so take a look. Part 3 begins on page 10. You'll take a look at the war of Shimon and Levi, and then part 4 is the Maral, begins on page 15. Shkayach. Okay, part 3. We have a meeting with the alligators, so we're going to have to do part 3 quickly. I want to thank again Reb Nosson Weldler for arranging the beautiful Yarchei Kallah. Tremendous success so far. And I want to thank my dear friend Reb Michael Behar for doing a lot of the groundwork and legwork and setting and not doing anything. Thank you very much for not doing anything. And especially for this microphone that I'm very grateful for. Okay, part 3. So we mentioned that Rav Goren was the one who sort of created and invented the concept that Jewish warfare is governed by, and I want to give a very special Yasher Koyach to Reb Gedalia Schwartz for disseminating all the Shiurim around the clock, 24/6. Actually, there's a new platform called 24/6. The Shiurim are available on 24/6, but the original 24/6, Reb Gedalia Schwartz, and we want to welcome his father. Yeah? Thank you for joining us today. Okay, so part 3, we learned that Rav Goren was the first to establish that a Jewish country has certain guidelines in terms of how it conducts warfare, and those guidelines, like all aspects of Torah, are predicated on the principles of Torah. And Rav Goren had a very interesting take on perhaps the first war recorded in the Chumash, and that is the war of Shimon and Levi versus the city of Shechem. Now, we're going to see in part 4, maybe we'll do part 4, we're going to have a little bit of a switch in schedule. Maybe we're going to do the Lamda Shashir on the bus, because you didn't hear me enough yet. And we're going to do part 4 when we get back. Okay? Because I want all the Shiurim on this subject matter to be here in the Beis Medrash. But Rav Goren had a very important and unusual take on the story of Shimon and Levi. We all know Dinah was taken, Dinah was abducted, Dinah was violated. Shimon and Levi came and they murdered not only Shechem, not only Chamar, but the whole city. The whole city. And Yaakov Avinu had a problem with what Shimon and Levi did. Yaakov Avinu said to them, Achartem oisi lahavisheni b'yoshev aretz. You sullied me. You sullied my reputation. You dirtied me. And Shimon and Levi seemed to have had the final word. They said, Hakazoina yasas achesenu. You're going to make our sister like a harlot. The words Achartem oisi imply that there was nothing fundamentally wrong with what Shimon and Levi did. Yaakov Avinu didn't say, Roitzchem atem, you're murderers. You killed them in cold blood. He didn't say that. He said, you're sullying my reputation. In the UN, they're not going to be happy with me. Achartem oisi. And Shimon and Levi said, yeah, but, what else am I supposed to do? We're going to allow our sister to be sullied? So the literal words, if you translate the words, it would seem to indicate that Yaakov Avinu did not have a fundamental problem with what Shimon and Levi did. The issue is the way the nations of the world would perceive it. But another thing we have to take into account is many, many years later, on Yaakov Avinu's deathbed, Yaakov Avinu didn't let the matter rest. He cursed at least the wrath of Shimon and Levi. He said, Shimon Levi achim, kleichom zcherosem, besides, I don't want to have anything to do with you. Or rapam kiyaz, be'avrasa ki kashasa. So famously, the Rambam asks that halachically, how could Shimon and Levi kill the residents of Shechem in cold blood? They murdered them. Only Shechem ben Chamar violated Dinah. So the Rambam at the end of Perek Tes of Hilchos Malachim, Halacha Yadalid, justifies the act of Shimon and Levi. And he says, listen, says the Rambam, Bnei Noach are obligated on dinim. They're obligated to set up just court systems, a judicial system. And if they allowed the public kidnapping and violating of Dinah, so there are no innocent civilians. They're supposed to uphold the law. They're all guilty. They're all murderers. They're not murderers, they're all violators of one of the 7 Noachide laws, and that is dinim. And therefore Shimon and Levi were justified not just in killing Shechem ben Chamar, but in killing the entire city, because they're all obligated to set up a just society, and they didn't do that. So according to the Rambam, Shimon and Levi were justified in their actions, and truth be told, the language of the Psukim implies like the Rambam. Yaakov Avinu didn't say, you're murderers. Yaakov Avinu said, you sullied my reputation. But it's well known the Ramban disagrees with the Rambam. The Ramban asks, really? Shimon and Levi did the right thing? So then, Kol HaKoydem Zoicha, then why did Yaakov Avinu himself not participate in the mitzvah? Yaakov Avinu should have led the charge to kill out the city of Shechem. Says the Ramban, you're going to tell me that the whole city of Shechem is responsible for not trying in court Shechem ben Chamar? Shechem ben Chamar is the king of the city. You know what kind of corrupt government they had? You think a regular guy on the street has an obligation to set up a court system to try the king of the land? So Ramban holds that Shimon and Levi acted improperly in killing out the city of Shechem mitzad halacha. They were not authorized to do that, even though the Ramban says the residents of Shechem were all oivdei avodah zarah, so they were definitely chayiv misa, and therefore technically they were not liable for murder, but it's not within the jurisdiction of Shimon and Levi to go ahead and to kill people who were oivdei avodah zarah. That's up to Shamayim, that's not up to them. So Rav Goren pointed out as follows. According to the Rambam, Shimon and Levi were justified in what they did from a halachic viewpoint, but not from an optics viewpoint. In other words, according to the Rambam, Shimon and Levi were authorized to kill Shechem ben Chamar, but Yaakov Avinu held that this was not a wise thing to do, because in a sense it was maybe a chil Hashem for the rest of the nations of the world. And the Ramban held that halachically they were not allowed to do so. Okay? But now this is Rav Goren, so to speak, building his edifice of the ethics of war. And this is very important. Nekuda, we're going to come back to it at the end of this year. And please, nobody quote me that, I quoted this personality, that personality. I'm here just to present to you the Mar Makoimos and various viewpoints, just to condition ourselves to recognize that there's a method to how we should view these types of situations. Okay, so here we go. Says Rav Goren, even according to the Rambam, where fundamentally Shimon and Levi did not do anything wrong, and it was only, let's say, optics, Chil Hashem. But Yaakov Avinu, later at the end of his life, if he spoke so harshly to Shimon and Levi, and he said, Oror Apam, and he cursed them, that means Yaakov Avinu held fundamentally what Shimon and Levi did was wrong. So why would it be wrong fundamentally? And I want to take you all the way to the end of the Maramakoimos to a Yerushalmi. And the Yerushalmi, we're going to come back to it tomorrow, Be'ezus Hashem. It's on page 46. The Yerushalmi tells us that if there's a group of Jews and bandits come and they say, give us one of you, otherwise we're going to kill everybody. Are you allowed to give that person up? No, you can't give that person up. What's the logic why you can't give that person up? After all, if we don't give him up, they're going to kill everybody. The logic is, a human being can never make a decision whose life is more valuable to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is not within the realm of Basar Adam to determine who is more important to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Well, I know that person is a Gadol Ador, this person is an Am Haaretz. No. No human being can make a decision on who's more valuable to Hashem. However, what if the Goyim designate somebody? They say, give us Yankel Am Haaretz, otherwise we're going to kill everybody. You're allowed to give over Yankel Am Haaretz. The Yerushalmi says that Tani, Siyos Ve'el Shem Achim Adarach, Pagulahem Goyim, V'amratzunu Lanu Echad Mikem, V'nara Goysav, Yomlav Hareinu Hargim As Kulchem, Afilu Kulam Ne'arogim, even if everyone's going to die, Lo Yimsu Nefesh Achas Yisrael. But Yichdu Lahem Echad, if one of them is designated. Remember we were supposed to finish 12:15? That was theoretically we were going to finish 12:15. What? Doesn't matter. Now, Yichdu Lahem Echad. If they designated one, we're going to try as close as possible. What if they designate Kagon Sheva ben Bichri? Then you give him up and you don't let everyone else be killed. But and there might be a Tanai that person is Chayiv Misa. Rabbi Yochanan says even though it's not Chayiv Misa. Then the Gemara tells us a story that Rabbi Shua ben Levi was with a group of people, and the Goyim said, if you don't give up somebody, we're going to kill everybody. There was a certain individual over there named Ula Bar Koshev. And Ula Bar Koshev met the bill to be given over. And now, here's another thing. Is somebody allowed to jump up and say, okay, I'll give up my life to save everybody? Yeah, they're allowed to do that. So Rabbi Shua ben Levi convinced somebody, Eliyahu ben Kosev, he said, look, perhaps you're Chayiv Misa anyway. You should be the guy. And Rabbi Shua ben Levi prevailed, and this individual gave up his life, and everyone was saved. Says Yerushalmi, Eliyahu Hanavi used to appear regularly to Rabbi Shua ben Levi, and he stopped showing up. So Rabbi Shua ben Levi fasted many fasts, and he said, Eliyahu, where have you been? Eliyahu said, you did the wrong thing. He said, what do you mean, I did the wrong thing? I followed the halacha. The halacha is, nobody's allowed to give up their life, but if somebody offers, and to save everyone, then isn't that better than the alternative? And Eliyahu said, yes, halachically it's better than the alternative. But v'lav mishnas chasidim hi. Halachically it's mutter. But al pi musar it wasn't the right thing to do. Question is, musar shmusar. It's very nice, musar. But is it better that everyone should die? And we're going to see the Chazon Ish ask that kasha. And we're going to see at the very end tomorrow how the Chazon Ish deals with it. But Rav Goren says one thing we see from the Yerushalmi is that when it comes to people's lives, even though halachically certain things are permitted, al pi Mishnas Chasidim, you have to go above and beyond the call of duty. You have to be above any reproach. For example, of course Bezdin is allowed to take somebody's life, but Lamaisa, a Bezdin that killed more than every 70 years, was considered a murderous Bezdin. Why? It's just following the halacha, because there's nothing more important than human life. Says Rav Goren, even though according to the Rambam, halachically, Shimon and Levi were doing what they were allowed to do, Yaakov Avinu held they were not allowed to do it. Why? Because even when you are allowed to take someone's life, but when it comes to taking the life of any human being, you have to be above and beyond all reproach. You have to be above and beyond any question. So this episode of Shimon and Levi, where ultimately Yaakov Avinu criticizes them on his deathbed, served as the basis of this value system that Rav Goren created of the ethics of war, that everything has to be viewed from this prism, that even when something is permitted, and even when it comes to the nations of the world, but we always have to hear the cry of Yaakov Avinu, Achartem oisi. Okay? That's part 3. Now if you're listening at home, you don't have any right to listen to any of this material unless you hear the whole thing. So I'm making a t'nai. This morning we learned about stipulations. If anybody wants to listen to part 1, 2, and 3, they may listen to it on condition they hear the entire subject in its entirety. Thank you very much. Okay, good morning everyone. We're continuing with possibly the main part of the subject, the ethics of war and halacha, warfare and innocent civilians. Yesterday in part 3, we brought that Rav Goren built the foundation of his ideology, that the ethics of war are governed by the precedent of the Torah. Rav Goren marshaled the story of Shechem, who was murdered by Shimon and Levi, that even according to the Rambam, it was not legitimate what they did. And even according to the Rambam, that it was legitimate halachically because they didn't set up courts, but nevertheless Yaakov criticized them, and Rav Goren developed an idea that when it comes to murder, there's a certain higher standard called Mishnas Chasidim that we see from Rabbi Shua ben Levi, that even though he had no alternative but to turn in this individual, nevertheless Eliyahu would not speak with him because he did not meet the bill of Mishnas Chasidim. So it's interesting, Rav Goren looked at the episode of Shimon and Levi, and instead of saying, well, Shimon and Levi killed out the city and they had the last word, they said, Hakazoni Yases Hakasenu. So let's learn from there that if someone of a nation attacks us, we're authorized to obliterate the entire community. He came to the exact opposite conclusion, and he built his whole edifice based on that story. However, one of the most classic Mefarshim arrives at the exact opposite conclusion, and upon which most legitimate sources base their ideology of the ethics of war upon the Maral, who reached the exact opposite conclusion that we brought from Rav Goren yesterday. And so Rav Goren built this edifice of higher standard. No, today we're going to learn there is a very traditional viewpoint that from the episode of Shimon and Levi we could learn out something called collective responsibility, which means if you have a nation of 1 million people and an individual from that nation, representative of the body of that nation, commits an atrocity against us, there is no such thing as innocent. There's collective responsibility. Okay, and let's see that in part 4, page 15. This might be the most important Maramakim in a certain sense. Okay, we're going to page 15, right hand column, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines from the bottom. Ach Kasha. Page 15. Ach Kasha. Im Shechem chata, kol ha'ir ma'chatu la'roig. Shechem sinned. Did the whole city sin? So the Maral quotes the Rambam that Bnei Noach are mitzuva and dinim, and one avera that they're over, they're neheragan, and because the city did not set up dinim, they're all chayiv misa. So the Maharal asks, the Rambam is a tema. Look 5 lines from the bottom. Uve'emes dvar temahim. The words of the Rambam are astounding. Elu advarim. These words are astounding. Ki eich efshar lohem ladon es ben nasi haaretz. Is it possible for a community to judge the son of the king? Ki hayu re'emehem. Certainly the people of the city were fearful of him. Even though they are commanded on dinim, that's if they're able to adjudicate. If it's an extenuating circumstance, there's no question they're exempt. How would it be possible to judge them? So therefore the Maharal summarily rejects the Rambam. Says the Maharal, Venira, Deloy Kashamidi, listen carefully. Mishum Deloy Dami, Shnei Umais, Kagoin Bnei Yisrael Ukanaaniyim. We cannot compare 2 nations, like Bnei Yisrael and Canaan. Shehem Shnei Umais, they're 2 different nations. How do we know they're 2 different nations? Because they proposed, V'hayinu la'am echad. Let's be one nation. That implies u'metchila loy nechshav la'am echad. Ulefikach hutar lahem lilchem kedin uma shebal lilchem al uma acheres. Therefore, it is permitted to wage war like the law of one nation that comes to battle another nation. Shehitira haTorah. The Torah allows war, and war means inevitable, innocent people will die. Doesn't the Torah say, "Ve'afagav de'amra Torah ki sikra v'lir li'lachem aleh"? If you approach the city to fight, "Ve'karasei la l'shalom," then you have to give them opportunity to do peace. Yeah, Hainu heicha d'lo yasu l'Yisrael davar. Of course, you have to give an opportunity to do peace. If you're going to attack a nation, you have to say, "Shalom aleichem, nation. This is our land. Knock, knock. The IDF is here. Leave immediately so nobody gets hurt." And over the years, I think in 2008, they developed a system of advanced door knocking. Instead of actually door knocking, they call the personal cell phones of civilians in Gaza and say, "We're about to bomb the area in 5 minutes. Get out, or your life is on the line." And very often they wouldn't leave. So they developed an even more advanced technique. They drop some type of missile on the house that causes very minor damage and a big explosion and doesn't cost life. And people get scared. So the civilians who wanted to be stubborn against their better judgment leave out of fear. And then they drop the real bomb when the civilians leave. That's a technique they've developed. No other nation in the world does anything remotely similar to that. And it's against their best interest because the unwanteds there also are warned, and they're given ample time to escape very often. But the Maharal says, of course you have to give them the opportunity to make peace. That's when they did it, they're unprovoked. But when they commit an atrocity against us, if they act against the Jewish people, for example, in the case of Shechem, that they breached the barriers of propriety, to do this atrocity, even though it was only one of them, kivan demechalal ha'amhu, since they're part of the nation, kivan shepartzu lahem tchila, they started mutarim likach mikmasam mehem. Revenge is permitted against who? The entire nation. When do you have to open in peace? If they didn't attack us, if they were unprovoked. So you say, we need to conquer. We're giving you time to leave with your lives. Then you open with peace. But when one person provokes us, there is no concept of, now let's decide who is innocent and who is guilty. There's something called war. But war, milchama. Eis shalom ve'eis milchama. And at a time of war, there's collective responsibility. Says the Maharal, "V'hachinami kol milchamos shehim nimtzaim." All warfare is like this. Kagoin sroras hamidyanim. You think every Midianite committed an evil act against the Jewish people? There were some good Midianites. There were some upstanding citizens. No, there's something called Eis Milchama. And in the time of Eis Machama, you're allowed to go to war. There's collective responsibility. Af agav dahayu harba shalei asa ein ze chiluk kivan shahayu ba'oisa uma sha'asa rad lahem. Since there was among this nation that did evil to them, mutarim lavai alehem l'malchama. You're allowed to go to war against them. V'chein heim kol ha'malchama. This is the very nature of all warfare. So you see from the Maral an exact opposite conclusion that Rav Goren drew. Rav Goren said, well, Yaakov Avinu was upset at them, so even though maybe halachically it was sanctioned, but they need to act above and beyond the call of duty. No, the Maral says that from the actions of Shimon and Levi we see there's something called collective responsibility. Now, if the Maral was just left at this, then we would say this is just his perush on Chumash. Now, I want to bring up a very interesting question. This Maral seems to contradict the Gur Aryeh we saw yesterday. Because the Gur Aryeh we saw yesterday implies that Yaakov Avinu was afraid he might Shema Yarog Acherim. He might kill civilians. What was he afraid of? So what if he might kill civilians? But what about collective responsibility? Esav's coming to attack him. They're guilty parties. There might be innocent parties. But what about the logic of the Maral? That everyone is responsible. Esav was coming to kill him. There's an unprovoked attack. So, Shoveno Mavchin, Ben Sadik LaRasha. In other words, according to this, how does this ideology of the Maral fit in with what Yaakov Avinu was afraid of Yiro Yaakov Oid Vayetzela? This Rav Asher Weiss asked in the Minchas Asher. What? Was he an Ummah? So my father-in-law is saying very good that maybe the logic of the Maral only applies if it's nation versus nation. So then we could say that the entity, if somebody acts on behalf of the entity of a nation, there's collective responsibility upon the whole nation. But Rav Asher Weiss says, Esav is not an Ummah. Esav is he's his brother. He's a lone personality. He might have other people joining him, but would they be categorized as an Ummah? Perhaps not. And then we don't necessarily apply this logic of the Maral, collective responsibility, or Rav Asher Weiss says maybe collective responsibility would apply, but nevertheless it's still not something that we're happy that we have to do, and Yaakov Avinu was still distressed that he would perhaps rightfully be killing innocent people. Those are two possibilities. A very controversial, and I'm only bringing this up, and again, there's no authorization to clip and shorten any sound bites from this series, because many of the things I'm telling you are for the sake of your appreciation and understanding of the historical process of how these different approaches develop. So some of the personalities, it's worthwhile to know about whether you agree or disagree with their particular ideology. A very controversial sefer was written called Toras HaMelech from Rabbi Yitzchak Shapira and Rabbi Yosef Elitzur. That it was so controversial, it was brought, I believe, to the Supreme Court of Israel. And the accusation was that this book is inciting violence, because it basically marshaled this Maral as a justification for the army that any time there's any type of lone attack, to take wholesale revenge. And this was brought to the Supreme Court, and the ultimate decision was that it was not considered a federal crime. This sefer was not a federal, but it was a very controversial sefer. And the name of it again is Toras HaMelech, and one of the main pillars of the book is this Maral, that the idea of collective responsibility. And there was a sefer written against the Toras HaMelech. It's called Derech HaMelech. Now, obviously, the Toras HaMelech was embraced by the very nationalistic movements in Israel. And there's a Sefer Derech HaMelech by Rabbi Ariel Finkelstein. And he has a Haskama, if you look at number 28, on page 20, from a Rav Yaakov Ariel, who says that relying on this Maral, if you look in Oy Zayin, to create the ideology of collective responsibility, and therefore everyone is chayiv misa. Now listen carefully. There are really two ways of saying the Maral. Does the Maral mean to say that even though they're innocent people, but nevertheless they're part of one entity, and everyone therefore is chayiv misa? That's how the Toras HaMelech presented the Maral. So the Rav Yaakov Ariel argued, no, that's not what the Maral means. The Maral doesn't mean that because of collective responsibility, everyone is chayiv misa. What the Maral means, because of collective responsibility, the other nation is authorized to go to war. And once you go to war, it's not practically possible to differentiate between the innocent and the guilty. It's not that the innocent are now chayiv misa. They're not chayiv misa. They're still innocent. But the other warring nation is authorized to go to war, and under those circumstances, it's not possible to differentiate and distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. So Rav Yaakov Ariel feels, again, this created a tremendous stir in the state of Israel. You know? Exact, very good point. There's a book, and a lot of the sources from this share I got from this book. It's called The Ethics of Our Fighters. And he argues against collective responsibility, that, you know, in fair reasoning, what if a right-wing settler committed an act? Does that mean the other side is now authorized to take wholesale revenge? You know? But even the more tempered view of collective responsibility, that it's not that everyone is liable to the Chiyav Misa, but now you're allowed to go to war, and once you go to war, you can't distinguish anymore. That doesn't really make things that much better, right? By the way, so Rabbi Yaakov Ariel says that the lumdus is not that because of collective responsibility, everyone is Chayiv Misa. The lumdus is, once there's collective responsibility, you're allowed to go to war. And once you go to war, it's not practical, lahavchin, bein sadik l'rasha, but you need to try, and therefore you need to do door knocking, and you need to warn them, and you need to give them maybe a safe corridor to leave. The bottom line is, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, just so, for the sake of honesty, and Lamaisa, the Poskim who discussed this issue, and namely Rav Hershel Shechter in the Sefer Be'ikvei Hatzayin, and Rav Asher Weiss in the Minchas Asher, Parsha Shoftim, and it's actually quoted in a new book by Tzvi Reisman. What is it called again? Contemporary Halachic Dilemmas, that I just got. He quotes the view of Rav Hershel Shechter, Rav Asher Weiss, as like the absolute conclusion on this, that based on the Maharal, as controversial as the Toras HaMelech may have seemed, the Poskim seem to go with it. Not like Rav Goren. That once the enemy provokes us and they commit an atrocity against us, we're permitted to go to war. And of course, the goal is not to take revenge on any innocent civilians, and with all respect to all of mankind and all human life, and kol makayim nefesh kilu kiyem olam maleh. And of course, in Judaism, not only Jewish life, but the life of any human being is of supreme value. But nevertheless, there are times that war is legitimate, and under those circumstances, how are you supposed to eliminate a terrorist if there's a human shield? It is completely permitted for an army to eliminate those who pose a danger to their citizens, despite the fact that they're going to be innocent casualties. Based on this Maral. That's the conclusion of Rav Hershel Shechter in Be'ikvei Hatzayin, as well as Rav Asher Weiss in Minchas Asher, Parsha Shoftim. I don't want anybody quoting my opinion. I'm here as a reporter to report to you the conclusion of the poskim that discuss this issue today. So, for example, in B'ikvei Hatzayin, and it's interesting, it was published by Art Scroll. Art Scroll published that this is the halacha conclusion, and these are the poskim that discuss it. So take a look on page 24. 24. He says, now Rav Hershel Schachter is talking about, let's say there's a lone terrorist attack. So is the army authorized to go in, eliminate that terrorist, and knock out the whole building? You say, well, it's not a war. Did that terrorist act at a Shas Milchama? So Rav Schachter says, since 1948, it has a din of Shas Milchama. It's all a continuation of one Shas Milchama. And Rav Asher Weiss seems to say the same thing, that there's no such thing as a lone terrorist act. It's all part of Milchama. And if you take a look on page 25, V'alpi hadvarim ha'eleh hayanira loymar duha dinami kal v'choymer hu b'zman hazeh she'yisrael aymed esi b'matzav shel Milchama, that we're at time where v'chol ha'prois v'hamhumay shebiyamenu dinam kehemshech me'amacham rishayna sharei ha'aravim toinim b'feirush u'v'fem molei she'im roitzim es Yerushalayim v'es Tel Aviv v'es Haifa. Yeah, they don't say, we're happy with Khan Yunis. That's all we need. We know what their chant is. We know what their mantra is. Umamelo tzrichim anshe tzal linoig im kol hamishtatfim be'elu aprois kemoi she'noyagim b'shas Milchama mamish shem yesh tzorech b'kach sheyaru b'hem almanas laharoig. V'im yesh tzorech b'kach ki lefamim menanimno levarer mi hem hamachablim v'hatrodistim hama'argenes haprois azmuos rashon b'chayom tzal lahakos v'af laharoig k'fi hadrush af acherim meyoysa uma shehem chafim mipesha. There's full-fledged right to fight and to react as you would at a time of Milchama. Where does this come from? Kemavuar begor aryeh lamaral miprag the parshas vayishlach. Just say, what was considered a radical view is in a way, presented here, and it's codified by Art Scroll. He says, okay, fine, that's his conclusion. And if we take a look in on the Minchas Asher on page 29, Ulachor Mizbar mitoch divrei Amaral, Dezet Toras HaMilchama, Shekol Ha'uma Nachsheves Leguf Echad. The whole nation's like one body. V'chol HaMishtayich Le'uma Sha'anu Nechamba Hutter Damai. Anyone that's part of this nation that we're fighting, his blood is permitted. Dikivan she'atir atar li'lachem umazu kol b'nei ha'uma k'guf echad heim v'hutter damam u'lefi derech zeh af l'chachila muter la'argam ve'en tzarich l'shtadel b'hatzalosim shalelu shaloi chatu. He argues even further. No door knocking is necessary. Meaning, that which the Haskama of the Sefer Derech HaMelech wanted to say, no, the Lamdus is not that they're Chayiv Misa. The Lamdus is, even though they're not Chayiv Misa, but practically Efshar Levarer. Rav Asher Weiss says that's not the Lamdus of the Gur Aryeh. The Lamdus is Hutra. No distinguishing is required. So, that's a very important and fundamental factor. We're not here to give halachic conclusions, but to be aware of Rav Goren looked at the episode of Shimon and Levi, and he derived that according to the Ramban, it was halachically forbidden. It's halachically forbidden to go to war against the whole nation. And even according to the Rambam, even though it's halachically permitted, but you have to act above and beyond Mishnas Chasidim. And the Maral looks at the story and derives that at a completely opposite viewpoint. And Rav Shechter and Rav Asher Weiss says accordingly, it would be permitted even l'chadchila. So, you embark on this topic of the ethics of war, and you say, okay, are we allowed to look at the episodes of Chumash? Even if we are allowed to look at the episodes of Chumash, you could study the same episode and arrive at two very disparate conclusions. Okay, so that's part 4 of the series, and a very important part. We're now going to move on to part 5. Part 5 is the Iker Lamdus of the Sugya. And the question is, how can a soldier go to war and risk his life? Going to war is not one of the 3 mitzvahs that you could give up your life for. Okay, good afternoon everyone. We're moving along b'siyata d'shmaya. This is a very vast subject, but I think that at least we're able to cover many of the general categories, and at least it gives us a certain prism of how to begin to approach, how do we look at what's taking place. Part 5 is what I call the categorical exemption of war from B'chai B'hem. In the mitzvah of lois lachun l'rachim al oived alilim, the mitzvah Tav Chav Hei, Sefer HaChinuch brings the mitzvah not to be merciful to the idolatrous nations, lois sechaya kol neshama, and the Sefer HaChinuch writes at the end, if you look on the bottom arrow, va'oiver al zeh, one who violates this, ubali yado yecha mehem, and one of them approach him, v'yachal lahargai, and you're able to eliminate mebli sheyistakin b'davar without endangering your own life, v'loi hargai, and you don't eliminate bitul asezeh. So the Minchas Chinuch asks, why does the Sefer Chinuch say that you violate this if your life is not in danger? Even if your life is in danger, you would still violate this. Why? It says in Minchas Chinuch, this is one of the most revolutionary questions in the entire sugya of warfare, and this is a principle that the Brisker Rav upholds, the Netziv upholds, and is mamish chai v'kayam in the sugya. The Minchas Chinuch asks the following question. We know there are only 3 mitzvahs that one is allowed to and commanded to give up their life for. In other words, does somebody have to give up their life not to speak by Chazar Sashatz? Let's say, you're not allowed to talk by Chazar Sashatz. But if your life is on the line, right? I'm giving you a heter now. If someone's life is on the line, they would be allowed to talk by Chazar Sashatz. Or let's say, if someone's life was on the line, they could bring a phone into the shul. Right? You would be allowed to bring a phone into the shul. Or, are you allowed to eat a treif to save your life? You have to eat treif to save your life. There are only 3 mitzvahs that you have to give up your life not to violate. The cardinal 3 sins, Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayos, and Shvichas Damim. Yeah? Going to war, even Milchemes Mitzvah, is not one of the 3 cardinal sins. So why should a soldier go to war? How is a soldier even allowed to go to war? V'chai b'hem. He's putting his life in, he's not to risk his life, right? Just let that question sink in for a moment. How can a soldier go to war? It's not Avodah Zarah. It's not Gilei Arayos. It's not Shvichas Damim. It's to defend Eretz Yisrael. It's a great mitzvah. But to give up your life? How does he have a right to give up his life? You hear the question? It's a very important question. Minchas Chinuch says the answer is obvious. The Torah says go to war. There is no such thing as a war where there are no casualties. It's implicit in war. Was there ever a war that there were no casualties? Maybe when Yehoshua ben Nun first entered Eretz Yisrael, there were no casualties. Or maybe the war against Sancherev, when there was like an earthquake, there were no casualties. Otherwise, there was never a battle in the history of the world that there were no casualties. And if the Torah gives a mitzvah to go to war, obviously the Torah is not written to rely on nisim. So implicit in going to war means there is no v'chai bahem. War is categorically exempt from v'chai bahem. The definition of war is to risk your life. Therefore, says the Sefer of the Minchas Chinuch, why does the Chinuch only say that if you have the opportunity to eliminate one of the Sheva Amamin without endangering your life, you violate the mitzvah? You violate the mitzvah if you don't kill them, even if you are endangering your life. Because that's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is whether you're endangering your life or whether you're not endangering your life. By the way, I think it just occurred to me, we could answer the Minchas Chinuch's question that the Chinuch, the Chinuch agrees with this principle, that you're required to give up your life to be Mekayim Loisachaya Kol Neshama. It's just if you don't give up your life, we're not going to say you violated, because at the end of the day, you're an oinus, because your life was on the line. In other words, you're required to give up your life. But if you don't, we're not going to say you are mavatel, because you're an oinus. Doesn't mean you don't have to do it. Okay? But from here we see the following principle, that when it comes to milchama, there is no mitzvah of v'chai bahem. Okay, you got that? By the way, the Netziv also reiterates this principle in his Chidushim on Erevin, on Daf Memhei. The Netziv says, on the 6th line, Deshani sakanas milchama Mishare Sakanois. Because what's the proof? In Yevamais, that David HaMelech put up 7 men from Shaul on the front lines, and the Gemara asks, hey, there's favoritism over there? In any milchama, the general could put b'sakana anyone who wants. Yaakov Avinu, when in the war against Esav, he put the Bnei Hashvachos first. But that's not a question at all. Milchama is different. Why? There's no Isser, Sakanas, Nefashos when it comes to war. When it comes to war, there's no Isser of Sakanas Nefashos. So again, the Nesiv reiterates this principle of the Sefer, the Minchas Chinuch, that when it comes to warfare, there's no idea of V'chai Bahem. And a third place where this principle is reiterated is in the Chidushim of the Brisker Rav on the Haftarah of Parshas B'Shalach, where on the pasuk Zvulun Am Cheref Nafshay Lamos, Zvulun risked his life to die. V'Naftali Al Maroi Meisada. The Brisker Rav quotes the question of the Minchas Chinuch that by all war there's sakanas nefashos and there's still a mitzvah to fight. It must be the mitzvah of going to war is different. Why? Why is it different? Because that's the mitzvah of war. The mitzvah of war is midinei milchama ein mashgichin b'milchama al sakanas nefashos. You know what the proof is? Are you allowed to wage milchemas rishus? Of course you're allowed to. That's what milchemas rishus is. How could you wage milchemas rishus? You're risking your life to acquire discretionary territory. The answer is, once you go to war, there's no v'chai bahem. There's no v'chai bahem. Okay, that's the principle. So I want to present the following argument. I believe I heard this from Rav Asher Weiss. Yeah.
Maggid yesterday about sacrificing one person. There's no v'chai bahem. We say, okay, so before you get killed, and that's good.
Say that again?
V'chai bahem doesn't apply to war.
V'chai bahem doesn't apply to war.
Sacrifice before as well.
So v'chai bahem doesn't apply to war, which means that someone's allowed to sacrifice their life, and they can't say, well, I'm not going to go to war because I'm not going to sacrifice my life. That's the mitzvah. So maybe what you're getting at is a very important point. That if, let's say, our army does not have a consideration of v'chai bahem, because when it comes to dinei milchama, we don't say that, well, human life, Jewish life is the ultimate cause. We don't even say that for our side. Think about that for a second, right? Even for our team, we don't say the most important idea. Some reason there's a Gzeras HaKosav. That when it comes to war, even though ordinarily Jewish life is the highest value, but that doesn't hold true when it comes to war. That doesn't even hold true for our side. Then Kal v'chomer, human life won't be the ultimate value for their side. That's a very compelling argument. If human life, if Jewish life is not the ultimate value for our legitimate side, so even if in general we do value Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, yeah, but Eis Melchama. Eis Melchama, there's no V'chai B'hem even to our side. So Rabbi Amram's saying, so if it doesn't have V'chai B'hem on our side, so then maybe V'chai, then certainly it doesn't apply to their side. So I believe what Rav Asher Weiss is saying with Rabbi Amram is that a little differently than the Maral. Listen to the Lamdas. The Maral holds that if they attack us, there's something called collective responsibility, and either we had a chakira, either they're all chayiv misa, but even if they're not, we can't distinguish practically. No, now there's a new Lamdas. Hutra. Hutra says there's no, in general, human life is the highest ideal. But b'shas milchama, if there's no v'chai b'hem mitzidenu, then hutra mitzidam. That might be also a legitimate possibility. That the whole idea of the value of human life is superseded for the greater cause of milchama. Eis milchama, the time of milchama, there are different rules. The whole world changes. This is a very important, two very important yediyos. Number one, the categorical exemption of V'chai when it comes to Melchama, and therefore extrapolating, then what would the ramifications be to the other side? Now, I want to take this one step further. An amazing machlokes. This Rabbi Asher Weiss brings in Parsha Shoftim. No, let's go a little further. Take a look on page 32. On page 32. Let's start with page 31. A Gemara in Shabbos, Yud Tesam and Aleph. Taner Rabbanan. This is in the first column, first paragraph, last 4 lines. Taner Rabbanan. You can't start to wage a war less than 3 days before Shabbos. Because less than 3 days before Shabbos, it's going to disturb your Einik Shabbos. If you began to fight before, ein mafsikin. You don't interrupt. Until victory. Afilu b'Shabbos. You're allowed to wage war even on Shabbos. Ad ridita. What's this drasha of Shammai? They're allowed to wage war even on Shabbos until victory. Is it talking about where our life is on the line? If our life is on the line, then I don't need a drasha of Adrita. Of course you're allowed to wage war even if your life is on the line, because you have to protect your life. Elamai, there's no pikuach nefashos. You're allowed to desecrate Shabbos to wage war even if there's no pikuach nefashos? What?
How do you know there's not the first? How do you know there's not the first?
Well, if your life is on the line, I don't need a drasha. And if your life is not on the line, why are you allowed to do it? It's amazing they have phones now that even when they're off, they still ring. It's a new kind of phone. Then the Rambam says in Hilchos Shabbos, "Mipi hashmua lamdu adridita afilu b'Shabbos." They learned this mipi hashmua. What's the source of such a thing? I want to share with you a very interesting halacha in the Rambam. Take a look on page 33. Page 33. Left-hand side, top paragraph. Page 33, left-hand column, top paragraph. The Rambam paskins, Chalutzei Tzava, a soldier, Kisheyichnasu b'gvul ha'akom, when he enters enemy territory. V'yichbashum, and he conquers, he sieges, v'yashvu lehem, mutter lohem lechal nevelois, utreifos, ubesar chazir. The soldier could eat nevela, treifa, pig, ukiyotze b'zeh. Im yirav v'loy matzah ma yochal, el machal selo asurim. If this is the food, this is the food. V'chein shoyse yayin nesach, could drink yayin nesach. Mi hashmua lamdu, ubatim malayim kol tov. When you find houses full of all good, arfei chazirin, fatty bacon. Did you ever want to eat fatty bacon? You enter the army, you conquer the city. There's no libers. They don't have libers. They don't have they don't have samar shchita. All they have is fatty bacon. The Rambam says you eat it. Frek the Radvaz mimanav shach. If your life is on the line, of course you're allowed to eat it. And if your life is not on the line, then why are you allowed to eat it? What's the Rambam talking about? What's the case? If your life's on the line, you're allowed to eat it even if you're in the Altair Hotel. Your life is not on the line, then don't eat it. Says the Radvaz, you know what we're talking about? Your life is not on the line. But you entered enemy territory. It's lunchtime. You opened up the pantry. There's no libers. So now what? I have to go searching every single house till I find kosher food? No! If I don't find it, Baruch Ata Hashem, Shahakol Niya B'dvaroi. What else? What other bracha you can make on Chazan? You're not required to be matriach. You don't have to be matriach. You're not mesukon. Your life is not on the line. You don't have to be matriach. If you're going to start checking every house, why don't you have to check every house? I don't know. Maybe it's booby trapped. Maybe there's a guy hiding in the closet. The pshat in the Radvaz is, what the Radvaz is saying, that at a time of war, there's a chidush. The chidush is, we have to be concerned with pikuach nefashos, af harochlik biyoser. Ordinarily, this is not makom sakana. If you're in the Altair and you don't find kosher food in the breakfast room, you can't say, okay, I'm going to go to McDonald's. So go somewhere else, find kosher food. But at a time of war, we have to be concerned with even the most remote possibility of pikuach nefashos. Therefore, the Rambam paskins that if you're fighting a war, no matter what, you don't find kosher food right away, you're allowed to eat treif. That's how the Radvaz understands the halacha. That's how the Radvaz understands the halacha. We're talking about war. During war, any pikuach nefashos we're concerned with. Why? It's because we have to be concerned for even the most remote possibility of pikuach. That's why the Radvaz says you're allowed to wage war on Shabbos. What if I don't need to wage war on Shabbos? What if I could wait for Sunday? No. You never know. Maybe if you wage war Sunday, maybe the enemy will preempt you. Even though there's no b'derech hateva pressing reason to violate the Shabbos, there's a chidush when it comes to Milchama that we're concerned for even the most remote possibility. By the way, people get very, edgy and judgmental. If anything takes place at a time of war on Shabbos, they should have waited. Saying, learn the sugya. You're right, maybe it could have waited. Under normal circumstances, it could have waited. In a time of war, there are different criteria, there are different parameters, there's different barometer. That's a sheet of Radvaz. The Rivash says more than that. Mechalelen es haShabbos l'chol tzorchei hamatzar afilu shaloi mibnei hasakana k'moi shabah haKabbalah ad ridita v'afilu b'Shabbos. The Sfas Emes agrees with the Rivash that there's a din milchama is doicha mitzvahs Shabbat. It's not that we're choshesh for a remote possibility of sakana. It's a din in milchama. So this segment of the shir is just observing the fact that in both ways, both in terms of every other mitzvah in the Torah, v'chai b'hem is a greater value. No, not by milchama. By milchama, v'chai b'hem is out the window. V'chai b'hem is not a value when it comes to war. When it comes to war, the value is winning the war. Period. There is no v'chai b'hem. Moreover, you see that the general guidelines of Shabbos and other mitzvahs, there is a certain din of ad ridita. Ad ridita means until victory, even if it means certain isurim, and that's basic halachas of milchama. And the lumdus of that is very fine. Could be machlekes Radvaz and Rivash. According to the Radvaz, it's that we're choshesh for the most remote possibility of sakana, and according to the Rivash, it seems like there's a categorical hudcha when it comes to milchama. That is part 5 of the shir, which is a signal for the cameraman to move in expedited fashion. Thank you. Go. Yeah. Okay. Part 6. In the siege of Beirut, where Yasser Arafat was hiding, there was an opportunity for the Israeli army to corner the city, to surround the city on all 4 sides. And Rav Goren developed a new element of the theology of the ethics of war based on the comments of the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim, Perek Vav, Halacha Zayin. And I might need some English historians here to summon a battle cry in the war against Dover. Do you remember this? I might need some help. Okay. Halacha Zayin. Check it out. Kishetzorin Alir. We're on page 35. Page 35. We'll get a refund. Kishetzorin Alir. When you set siege to a city, Latafsa. Ein makifin oisa me'arba ruchaiseha. You cannot surround it on all 4 sides. Ela mishalosh ruchaiseha. Only on 3 sides. Umanicha makam levrayach. You always have to give an opportunity for the enemy to run. Ulchol mi sharoisel himaled al nafshay, and anybody who wants to escape. There's a mistake. The next page should be a continuation. It's a double. Basically, the Rambam concludes, Mipi Hashmu Alamdu, we have a tradition that by the war of Midian it says, Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe, and we don't know what Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe. It says, take a look in number 4, page 40, Vayitzba'u al Midian, Pasuk Zayin, Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Zayin, they waged war against Midian, Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe, Vayahargu kol Zachar. What does it mean they waged war? Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe. The Rambam interprets it, Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe, that you never surround the city on 4 sides, you always give safe corridor for escape. Now, is that a logical way to wage war? You always give... Yeah, you could fight a war, but you always give them a chance to run away. What's the logic of that? What's the basis of that? What does the Rambam mean, mipi hashmua? So there's a tshuva of the Chacham Tzvi. Chacham Tzvi on page 37, Shaila Chavav. He talks about various restrictions and guidelines and limitations of what one is allowed to do against the enemy. Let's say, for example, take a look on the second column on the 4th line. Al Orei Hanachriim, against the city of Gentiles, Nitztavinu la'aniach ruach achas mebli matzar, you have to leave one side, not in siege. To anyone who wants to escape. Rambam in Hilchos Malachim, Parak Shishi, Din Zayin. There is a command when you approach a city to wage war. Even animals who can't talk were nitztaveh on Sar Balei Chayim. Even plants were commanded loisashchas as eitzah. Why? Says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, it's not for the sake of the enemy. We don't allow the enemy to run for their benefit. We allow the enemy to run for our benefit. Why? Einoi bavur ha'pa'ol ela bavurenu anachnu ha'poyalim. It's for our benefit. Liknois benavshenu deois amitios. In order for us to acquire proper attitudes, umidois toivos, and good character, v'yashros the rationale of the Rambam of safe corridor is for the benefit of the character of Klal Yisrael, not the benefit of the outcome of the nations of the world. And therefore in the war of Beirut, Rav Shlomo Goren argued vehemently that they cannot surround the city on four sides based on this Rambam. He felt this Rambam was an imperative in the ethics of halachic warfare. And when they indeed left an open corridor, Rav Goren was very proud that this was a great Kiddush Hashem. Unfortunately, those terrorists escaped, and very soon after they committed terrible atrocities and terrorist attacks. So the question really is this safe corridor an absolute gezeras hakasav? That these are the guidelines of war under all circumstances, even potentially putting our own life in danger? Or is it just a recommendation of midos v'derech eretz, but certainly not to put Jewish life at risk because of it? You're not going to find in the Mishnah Brura a halachic conclusion of how to apply the rule of fourth side open. Now I'm remembering in the war against Dover, the invading army, the captain and the general put the ships on fire. And they turned around in the harbor and they saw their ships were on fire. And the general said, "Fight until you die." You know about this? That's how they won the war. Which war? What war? Beyond the scope of this shir. And that's a completely different logic. Take a look in the Torah Tamima in page 40. This will be the conclusion of part 6. You know, the Rambam paskins that you have to leave a fourth side open. Reb Nassan, you're in the shir here. Okay, I'm making sure you're listening. On the pasuk, Parak Lamed Aleph, pasuk Zayin, Vayitzba'u al Midyan kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe. And Vayitzbu, they waged war against Midian like Hashem commanded Moshe. What does that mean, like Hashem commanded Moshe? The Chachamim say, look in the Sifra, quote in the Torah Tamima, Hikifua midaru chayseha. They surrounded it on four sides. Rab Nassan Omer, Nasan lohem ruach ravias kadesha yivrachu. They gave them a fourth side, so that they could run away. Who does the Rambam paskin? Like the Chachamim or Rab Nassan? Like Rab Nassan. Why would the Rambam paskin like Rab Nassan against the Chachamim? So this is what the Torah Tamima is bothered by. That the Kesef Mishnah brings this Sifri as a source for the din of the Rambam. V'hu Pella. V'lo nizbar lama pasuk Rambam k'Rab Nassan neged Chachamim. And what does the Rambam mean? Mipi hashmua lamdu. Where is it merumas this shmua? Where did Rab Nassan get this from? That's a general question you could always ask. Okay. So the Torah Tamima suggests that there's a Yerushalmi that when Yeshua was about to enter Eretz Yisrael, he sent 3 messengers with 3 different proclamations. One of them was Mi sharoitza lihi panois levroyach yifneh. Where did Yehoshua get that from? It must be he got it from this pasuk Kasher Tziva Hashem. That's muchach like Rav Nassan, and the Rambam was soymech on this brisa. Comes the Tar Tmima. What's the logic of leaving a fourth side open? The opposite of the svara of the Chacham Tzvi. The Chacham Tzvi svara is it's for the benefit of the attackers, so that we inculcate within ourselves a certain midah of mercy and kindness, and if we corner them in, so then we're really building up animosity and callousness to other people, and by leaving a fourth side open, we preserve a certain humanity. No. Says the Tar Tmima, it's just the opposite. You know why we leave a fourth side open? Because we leave a fourth side open and they always have an opportunity to run away, they won't fight like cats and dogs, and you'll be able to destroy them. But if you corner them in, then like now I know why we visited that alligator yesterday in the Everglades. Because when he feels threatened, it's very dangerous. Okay? So you don't ever want the enemy to feel there's no way out. When the enemy feels like that alligator, he's very dangerous. So you want him to feel he always has an opt-out. Once he feels there's an opt-out, here, look at these words. Uvetam ha'pirtza mirach raviyas yeshleimar mishum dimloi hinichu lahem kol pesach lihimalit hayoloichamim kulam kemisyashim ad she'eres kachasem. They're going to give it their all. V'haya kasha k'kayvsham l'zneisa. It will be very difficult to conquer. Masha'enkem yeshmakum lanos. So whenever there's an opt-out clause, then the war won't be as bitter. So this is a subject. When exactly you allow safe corridor, it's almost impossible to give guidelines. We don't really know what the logic of it is. Is it to engender mercy within us? And then it's going to depend on, well, we can't engender mercy at the expense of our own lives. But if it's some kind of psychological gzeres hakasov that you can never corner them in, otherwise you're never going to win, then, against our better judgment, we'll have to abide by that. And we don't really have clear guidelines regarding this issue. That completes section 6. Yes, Doctor.
It depends upon the psychological status and nature of the enemy. Because there are going to be different kinds of enemies. Some are going to be who just fight to the tooth, they don't care. And somebody's gain.
Yeah, good point.
Some of them will say, we'll turn ourselves in.
Yeah, that would be fair. That it would be perhaps required to psychoanalyze the thinking process of the enemy to determine how they'll react under those circumstances. So what we would have to do is, like the alligator, test them out. We would have to figure out how they would deal with such a circumstance. Okay, it's now 12:07. We're going to do the final two parts at 12:30. Okay, everyone. The Siyata D'Shmaya. I wasn't sure how this was going to happen. B'chlal, I wasn't sure how this whole topic can reasonably be presented. Baruch Hashem, we had a lot of Siyata D'Shmaya. We now move on to part 7. So I'd like to have part 7, part 8, and conclusion. Part 7 is the following question. Certainly, there is a category of war where you're fighting the enemy in order to save Jewish lives. You have terrorists who vow that if they ever had the opportunity, they would repeat what they did the first time. So you're doing it in an act of self-defense. Basically, lo heshias Yisrael miyad tsar. The Rambam brings 3 categories of milchemes mitzvah. Number 1, against Amalek. Number 2, against the Sheva Amamin. And then number 3, lo heshias Yisrael miyad tsar. But what if it's a matter of none of the above? What if it's purely a matter of revenge? Is there a category of war merely to take revenge against the enemy? Do we ever see in Chumash that there was a war not to prevent the enemy from repeating, merely as an act of revenge? We do. Sarar es hamidyanim v'hikisem oisam. Ki tzorim heim lachem. Nikoim nikmas b'nei Yisrael me'es hamidyanim. The Ramban writes in Parshas Matos, Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Beis, page 41. Nikoim nikmas b'nei Yisrael me'es hamidyanim achar teyasef alamecha. Nigzar al Moshe Rabbeinu shel Yavras hayarden. It was decreed on Moshe not to cross the Yarden. Me'ever l'Yarden also kom mitzvos Yisrael. He did everything he could on the other side. Natzach shnei malchei Amoir Gdolim. He defeated the two kings of Amoiri. V'chalak es artza menachla. He distributed the land. V'hu roi sheyas nekama b'seinei Hashem. And he is the one who's fit to bring vengeance to the enemies of Hashem. Ve'ein al Yehoshua rak mitzvahs haaretz. All that was devolved on Yehoshua were the mitzvahs of Eretz Yisrael. But Moshe Rabbeinu, he was commanded to take revenge. The war of Yehoshua was not a war of revenge, it was a war of conquering. The war of Moshe was a war of revenge. Why did Hashem give Moshe Rabbeinu the opportunity to take revenge? Shechalak loy HaKadosh Baruch Hu kavod zeh. It's a kavod to take revenge against the enemy. Sheyira v'yismach tzaddik. Why is it a kavod? Because the tzaddik rejoices. Ki chazan nakam. Hashem said, Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm going to bring you nachas ruach before you die. I'm going to allow you to see revenge against the enemy. So we see now from this Ramban, there's a category of milchemes nekama. Can you extrapolate based on this? Can you learn from here that what if the enemy attacks? Can there be reprisals, even if it will not prevent the enemy from doing it again? It occurred to me that from the Maral, it would seem that there is such a concept. The Maral says, if you remember going back to page 15, that the Maral says, Hechi da'asu Yisrael davar, k'goin shepartzu b'hem lasos lahem navala, afagav do'yasa rak echad mehem, kivan demechlal ha'amu, mutarim likach nikmasam mehem v'hachinami kol hamulchamois. Says the Maral, sorry to burst your bubble. What's the purpose of war? The purpose of war is not to stop them from doing it again. That's not even the objective of war. The objective of war is revenge. That is the objective of war. You know, in the modern world, the objective of war is security. That's not the definition of war. The definition of war is revenge, reprisal. He says, Maral, kol ha-milchamois. Now maybe this is why utilizing this Maral was considered so controversial. But these are the words of the Maral, open, black and white. If you look again at page 15, it says, the Maral, Kivan de mechlal ha'amhu, v'kivan shepartzu lahem tchila, mutarim likach nikmasam, v'hachinami kol ha-milchamois, k'goin sararas hamidyonim. Afagav dehoyu harbe shelo yasu. Ein ze chiluk. Kivan shahayu ba'isa uma sha'asa hara, mutarim lavay aleim l'milchama. So is there a category of milchemes nekama? Maral says no. There's no category. That is milchama. That is the definition of milchama. That's my personal observation. Rav Yisraeli, who we quoted in one of the earlier sections, he's the one who, so to speak, invented the terminology of milchemes nekama. He says in his Sefer Amud Hayamini on page 42, you know, there was an opinion that if the enemy didn't come yet, and it's preemptive, in other words, is a preemptive strike milchemes mitzvah? There are those who argue no, that's if they never came before. Once they've come once, that's not called a preemptive strike when you preempt them. That's called retaliation. Avalon kvarbo koidem, page 42. Ela she nisoigu. Once they've already attacked once and they retreated, umatarasam lachzor v'lavai. Yeah, the enemies on October 7th didn't say, okay, from now on, we're going to go to the shuls and we're going to sweep up and be in charge of bingo night. They pledged to do the same thing. Harehem begeder soyrei Yisrael. V'yesh v'hem din milchemes nekama shehi mitzvah l'kol yama. So is there such a category? The Ramban talks about it. The Maral defines all war that way. You have this opinion that sort of documents it. And I want to clarify one interesting point, because the Rambam does say in the Sefer HaMitzvahs that for any war to be Mechemes Mitzvah, even Shiva Amamin, even Amalek, even L'Hoshias Yisrael Miyatzar, you need a Melech. You need a Melech. Can anyone have the status of a Melech today? So, it's known, there was an opinion that's one of the very sensitive topics. What is the status of the government in the state of Israel? Without discussing whether the permissibility of it, and the question is, could they possibly have the status of a melech? So there's a famous tshuva in the Mishpatei Kohen. Rav Kook said that if they're elected in a democratic process, they represent the people, they have the status of a melech. And the wars that they wage are Mechemes Mitzvah. So you say, we know that not everybody agreed with that opinion. Is there any earlier sources? Absolutely. The Ramban writes it b'feirish. The Ramban, in his Hasagas on the Sefer HaMitzvahs, he says that anyone, mi sheha'am bershusai, anyone who the security of the people is in their domain, has the status of melech legabe milchama. So, again, we're not here to establish any final halachic rulings. I'm just presenting to you historical background, the sources on the issue, some of the main opinions that have been voiced. Again, it's 2,000 years. We don't have Gemaras about this subject. We don't have halachas and Shulchan Aruch. All we really have are the precedents in Torah Nevi'im and Ksuvim. And how to look at it and how to view it, obviously, there could be many different prisms and many perspectives. The clearest articulated in terms of a traditional Mefarshim is the Yarchei on the story of Shechem and Dinah. So that is the conclusion of part 7. Okay, this will be part 8, and then we'll give you closing words. I'm going to present you with a theoretical question. A very delicate and sensitive question. And the answer to this question should govern a great deal of how we think about everything that has taken place since October 7th and really in our history. It's a Yushalmi that we mentioned in an earlier section. Take a look in Yushalmi, Parak Ches of Masechta Trumos, with the commentary of Reb Chaim Kanievsky. We're on page 46. Tani, Sias b'nei Adam she'em halchem b'derech. You have a group of people traveling on the road, Pagu lahem goyim, and Gentiles meet up with them. V'amru tinu lanu echad mekem v'naragoy. Say, give us one, and we'll kill him. V'mlav harayanu hargim es kolchem. Otherwise, we kill everybody. We all know the halacha is afilu kulam ne'aragim. Even if everyone's going to get killed, la yimasru nefesh achas meYisrael. You can't give up one Jewish life. Yichdu lahem echad. Let's say they designate one and say, give us Pliny, Kagan Sheva ben Bichri. Yimasru Isai. You have to give him over va'al yahargo, and you can't let everyone be killed. Amar Reb Shimon Lakish, v'shei chayiv misik Sheva ben Bichri. Rish Lakish says, provided that individual was already chayiv misa. Rabbi Yochanan Amar afapi she'eno chayiv misik Sheva ben Bichri. Story. Ula bar Koisev Tavate Malchusa. Ula bar Koisev was wanted. You went into the post office, which was your first mistake. Never go into the post office. And you saw on the sign, Ula bar Kosev, wanted. Arak, he fled, va'azal le'lalud, gabi Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Asun va'akfun medinta. So the soldiers of the king came, and they surrounded the Medina. And they said, Amru lahen ein les atun yavin lon anam achrim medinta. If you don't give him over, if you don't give Ula bar Kosav over, we're going to kill the whole Medina. Salak gabe Rabbi Shua ben Levi upaise. Rabbi Shua Levi went over to him and he spoke with him. Turn yourself in. Turn yourself in. Otherwise you're jeopardizing everyone. V'yahav in line, and he gave himself in. Okay, before I read you the conclusion of the Yisham, I want to pose the following question. We know perhaps they're still surviving hostages. But you can imagine the deadliest, most vicious terrorists are probably using them as human shields. What would the halacha be if the only way to eliminate the terrorists would be to bomb them at the expense of the life of the hostages? Could you do it? Think about it. If these terrorists ever escape, they're not going to be sitting and learning Shari Tshuva and the Rabbeinu Yoino with the 20. They're not going to be, repenting their ways. What if the only way potentially to save Jewish lives would be, can you bomb the terrorists, putting the hostage's life in peril? What would you say about that case? How do you even begin to approach? So Rav Asher Weiss said if he would ever be asked this question, the answer can be found in this Yerushalmi. Salak gabe Rabbi Shua ben Levi v'paise. Rabbi Shua ben Levi spoke to the guy and he gave himself over. V'yave line. V'hav Eliyahu zocher l'tav yolef mizgali alave. Rabbi Eliyahu Hanavi used to appear to Rabbi Shua ben Levi regularly. V'lo yiskale. And he stopped appearing to Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Did some kamat soimin. Yeshua ben Levi fasted many fasts. V'iskale yilave. And he revealed himself to him. Amar lei ulmesaris ani nigla. Amar lei v'lei mishnah sisi. Rabbi Shua ben Levi said, what did I do wrong? I followed the halacha. I didn't give him over. I consoled him, I spoke to him, and I convinced him to give himself over. So what did I do wrong? Amar lei, Eliyahu said, V'zu mishnas hachasidim. Yeah, you followed the halacha. But you didn't go above and beyond the halacha. So Yerushalmi is a hafla v'fela. What do you mean he didn't go above and beyond the halacha? What's he supposed to do? What's he supposed to do? There are two choices here. Either everyone dies, or he gives himself in. Rabbi Shua ben Levi didn't give him over. He convinced him to give himself over, and he was killed. These are the only alternatives. These are the only choices here. What did Rabbi Shua ben Levi do wrong? Eliyahu said, no, you didn't go lefnim mishur sadin. What is that third option of lefnim mishur sadin? There is no lefnim mishur sadin. Lefnim mishur sadin is, you're allowed to do A, but I could have done B. There's no B here. It's either everyone dies, or the guy gives himself over. You know who asked this question? The Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish in Masechta Sanhedrin Siman Chafei. Look on your sheet in the last Maramakam. Ulafi Zeh. Uvda de Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Uvda de Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Afilu l'reish lakish kivan de Ula bar kasim neschayvel hen misa. Ay v'hada amar le'Eliyahu she'ein zu mishnas chasidim. Ratzalaymar she'ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mazmin davar kazeh l'chasidav. God would not put a righteous person in that situation. If someone ever had to make that tough decision, should everyone die, or should we try to convince someone to give up their life? What should I do, A or B? Says the Chazon Ish, there's choice C. What's choice C? Tzarech lehispalel sheyatzileu Hashem utfilasai vaday tekubal. You're required to daven, to extricate yourself from the circumstance, and certainly your tefillah will be accepted. Uke'ein de'avid Rabbi Chanina in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah de'bai rachmei v'achiyeh. That's the highest level requirement. That sometimes there are questions that are so difficult that there is no halachic answer. And the highest level response is to pour out your heart to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the Rebbeinu Shem should put us in a situation that we shouldn't have to make such a decision. So the bottom line is that many of the questions that we're faced with, it is the duty of the righteous in Kallah Yisrael, of course, first to pour out the heart to Hashem, first and foremost, for the security of Kallah Yisrael. And when faced with a very, very delicate and sensitive situation, to pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we don't always have all the answers, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the Goyal Yisrael, and He could extricate us from every bind and every jam. And not always do we have the right answer, and sometimes the requirement to daven changes the halachic onus. So in other words, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is held accountable, because even though he acted halachically appropriately, nevertheless, he was still required to daven. And because he didn't, now, not everyone's going to be on the madrega that they're going to be able to daven and their tefillah will be answered right away. So you can't chas v'shalom make a bad decision and say, well, we'll put our own lives in jeopardy while I'm still daven. I'm going to sit there in the corner and daven and daven and daven, and I'll let the Rebbeinu Shalom take care of this. No, there's certain mitzvahs, and we have to do our regular hishtadlus. But no matter how difficult the circumstance, there's always a chiyuv. Lamala lefnim mishra sadin is to be mispalal. Okay, so now I just want a few concluding words, which is a signal to the cameraman. Okay. Concluding words. We studied many aspects of this very sensitive and delicate subject. We pointed out that for 2,000 years these were questions that Kallah Yisrael never had to deal with. We never had a country that we had sovereignty over. We never had an army. And we were never faced with questions of the ethics of warfare. On the one hand, we saw that the Torah does place value on all human life. And one should never be callous toward that. And one should never lose a certain feeling of sensitivity and a feeling of humanity. And on the other hand, a person cannot allow, so to speak, the politically correct prevailing attitudes to warp the importance of brother rather than other. That Jewish law, as important as human life is, the life of a Yisraeli is of greater importance. They're our own family. Especially, we saw the guidelines of the Maral, where the Maral said there is a concept of once milchama is permitted, shuvei noi mavchen. Either there's collective responsibility, or practically it's impossible to distinguish. So what should the feeling of a Jew be at a time like this, where very major achievements are being made in the war, and it's certainly turned in our favor. On the other hand, there are heavy casualties. And sometimes people want to say, well, Maseh Yadai Toivim B'Yam V'atem Oimrim Shira, people are suffering, so should we be joyous that we're winning the war? Should we be in pain that people are suffering? After all, the Malachi Asheris wanted to sing Shira, and Hashem said, don't sing Shira. Maseh Yadai Toivim B'Yam. I think it's a bit of a mistake. Because even though the Malachi Asheris were told not to sing Shira, Kallah Yisrael sang Shira. So why is that? Why did the Malachim sing Shira? And the Jewish people, why were the Malachim not allowed to sing Shira? And Kallah Yisrael did. The Malachim were not allowed to, and Kallah Yisrael were required to. You know, there's a rule, Ein malach echad yachal lasa shtei shlichuyos. One angel can't do two jobs. So we think that means, the malach can't do refuah and then destroy the city of Sodom. No. Reb Schwab writes, what does it mean, Ein malach echad yachal lasa shtei shlichuyos? A malach is only able to have one perspective on an issue. He could either be merciful, he could either be compassionate, or he could be vengeful. But he can't see a situation and reconcile a dilemma or a dichotomy all at once. But a human being who was created in the image of Hashem has a much more sophisticated psychological makeup. So a malach, if the malach is going to sing shira, then the malach will become callous to the plight of those who are suffering. So Hashem said you can't sing shira, because if you're going to sing shira, then you're going to lose all sensitivity for those who are suffering. But Kallah Yisrael, when they saw the Mitzrayim drowning, they felt great compassion, and they felt rachamim, and they felt bad for the loss of life. And at the very same time, they sang B'simcha Rabba v'amru chulam mi chamoicha ba'elam Hashem mi kamoicha neder b'kodesh. How could they do that? There was such loss of life. Wasn't that callous to the enemy? Not at all. A human being has the sophisticated psychological makeup that at once it could feel the pain of those who are suffering, and at the same time feel the ecstatic joy of vengeance and victory. And which feeling is stronger? The simcha rabba v'amru chulam. But at the same time, a person always has to preserve, I think, their feelings of humanity and compassion. But brother rather than other. Your feeling to Achenu B'nai Yisrael certainly should be the predominant feeling, and at the same time recognize Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tzelem. But in the equation of things, brother rather than other, and I think that's a fair assessment of a good approach of what to think. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. It's been a great honor. Thank you, Reb Nosson Weldler, for all your hard work. And Be'ezus Hashem, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.